Hello everybody and welcome back to Ethelor Plays Go. Today I'm going to continue my Baduk Mindset video or series, and today I'm going to be talking about how to approach Tsumego. There is a lot to talk about, so let's just get into it. So first thing that I want to cover is basically how to do life and death. Life and death problems are where you have a collection of stones on the board, and your task is usually some kind of a concrete position, and you need to read out if how to kill your opponent or how to live with your own stones. And basically what you do is you need to read out the entire position, even the ones that don't necessarily end in the result that you're looking for. And basically the goal is just to read out everything. Hopefully then you find the answer about how to live or how to kill or how to ko or seki or whatever the case may be. But basically what this means is that it's okay to not have solutions because the point is to read every variation and not necessarily to know which one's the right one. Hopefully you'll have figured out some kind of an answer and hopefully that will be correct, but that's not always super important, as we'll find later. There are a couple of different comparisons that I want to make. So doing life and death problems on paper versus online versus how hard should the problems be, and should you do collections or should you do more problems at a certain level, and that kind of thing. Also, the difference between life and death, Tesuji, and essential Tsumego, these kinds of things. So first, let's start with easy versus hard problems. Easy problems are ones that you'll be able to solve very, very quickly, usually not getting many wrong. And so easy problems represent shapes and patterns that you already kind of understand, and their use is mostly in keeping those shapes kind of warm in your mind. So often it can be a recommendation from strong players that if you're playing in a tournament, you should do a lot of easy problems, because then if the easy problems show up in your games, which they're likely to because they're relatively simple positions, then you'll remember those a lot better. However, you can't just do easy problems because those are shapes you already know. You also need to do problems that are difficult for you to help you to grow your reading ability. And so it's important to strike a balance between easy ones and hard ones. Often people either do problems that they already understand because those are relatively easy, but also sometimes people will do hard problems and spend minutes trying to analyze a single position. And usually that's not very productive either, because it's a bit frustrating. Unless it's something that you really enjoy, that can be something that can be a bit beneficial. But normally it's good to combine them a little bit. And then collections versus problems at a certain level. So collections will be problems that you are laid out in a specific order. So say an example would be Chojigun's Encyclopedia of Life and Death, where shapes are introduced to you in a certain sequence, and you'll get to see shapes with a certain frequency. So you'll see sometimes some after the other, or sometimes they'll be tossed to later in the series as a reminder. And they'll modulate in difficulty, these kinds of things. And so it's not just doing a lot of problems, it's also the having a collection can sometimes be intended as a course, or a collection of shapes that a author thinks are important. So sometimes different collections will emphasize different kinds of shapes, and so it can be useful to go between different collections. But they can also be a bit limited in variety because there's only so many shapes that an author might be able to think of or put into a single book. Whereas when you're doing problems more online, there'll be more variation between problems, but that can make it more difficult to learn the shapes because they're not presented to you in like a certain kind of way. So yeah, that depending on what your preferences are, what your goals are, you might choose different approaches. For instance, when you're doing problems on paper, you'll be more inclined to read everything from start to finish because you're not able to just click on the screen. Whereas if you're on a screen, you need a little bit more discipline, but at the same time, you get that access to more varied problems, which can sometimes be useful. Or even just very specific problem sets that you might not be able to get in real life. So for instance, like on Tsumego Hero, you'll have easy capture, easy life and death. Um, yeah, and those are trivially as trivial problems as you can have, or maybe better said, as simple or as rudimentary. Um, but those problems you won't necessarily get in paper form, and so yeah, depending on what you need, I'll change where you look. Now that I've described the different ways you might come across problems, I'll talk a bit about getting into the habit of doing problems. So you should probably start with as easy problems as you can manage if you've never done life and death problems before, or if you think, oh, I don't really like doing them. A lot of the negative feelings that people have from doing life and death problems are doing the complicated ones, the ones where you sit there for 10 minutes and you just can't figure out the answer. And that can be disheartening. And so if you're somebody who doesn't like doing life and death problems, then I just would suggest that you don't do very difficult ones. And then make sure you set a timer and to do them regularly. So say you will do only 10 minutes a day or something to that extent. That can already time gate what you're doing. It might also give you pressure to move on between problems instead of spending too long on a difficult set. Um, and yeah, if you stick to that habit, then what will really make the habit start to stick is when you start reading better than your opponents and when you start beating them. I found that for me, that was a really big motivating factor. And so that can't be understated. Another thing that I want to discuss is the difference between life and death and Tesuji problems. So life and death will help you to evaluate group strengths better. And so, interestingly, even though you're technically studying something that's really technical, it generalizes to you being able to do something that's more strategic, being able to evaluate the whole board position, figure out which groups are strong and which ones are weak. This is why doing life and death problems are essential to your playing ability. But it's not just that. For instance, Tesuji can be clever plays, or they're defined as clever plays, and those usually come from shortages of liberties and really thin shape and these kinds of things. And so Tesuji problems can help you a lot if your fighting ability is weak. Obviously, life and death problems will help as well, and there is a bit of an overlap between the two. So a lot of Tesujis will show up in life and death problems, and vice versa. But doing Tesuji will help you from overextending your stones and collapsing. So it's good to know the difference when you'd want to do one versus the other. Technically, you should really do both, and technically, if you're doing one, you'll do a bit of the other. But yeah, that's important to know. Another thing that I want to cover is essential Tsumego. So essential Tsumego are usually Tsumego that are relatively difficult to read, and that you don't really read out during a game. You have them memorized before the game, and so when they happen, you're prepared for playing the right moves. And and so essential Tsumego fall under things that you would count as knowledge as opposed to your reading skill. Um, so your reading skill has to do with being able to solve problems on the spot, having never seen the problem before. You might have some prior knowledge based on shapes, but really it depends on your reading ability. Whereas essential Tsumego count more as knowledge because it doesn't depend on this reading ability. It instead depends on your knowledge to just know it beforehand and know the answer. And so this can come to memorization. A lot of times people will try to memorize life and death problems. I don't necessarily recommend doing this because, as I mentioned, when you're training your reading ability, memorization is beyond the point. Even if you know a lot of shapes, it's not about the knowing the shapes, it's about using that ability to read, and you sharpen that skill by using that ability. And so this is also why having solutions to your problems are not always necessary, because it's the reading that's the point. That's why if you, for instance, have Chojikun's Encyclopedia of Life and Death, if you don't have solutions and if you're just solving it on paper, then that's completely fine and valid. You'll just sit there, read it to the best of your ability, and move on. Whereas if you're online, it can also be useful to have access to answers. So that can be useful. But yeah, so that's why I wouldn't necessarily recommend memorizing unless it's a essential Tsumego, which is difficult and appears frequently in your games. And on that note, a lot of things that were classified as essential Tsumego are now no longer necessarily so, because the corner Joseki and patterns that we play have changed. And so as the positions that we play change, what counts as valuable knowledge also changes. For instance, like knowing various Joseki, the old ones, not necessarily as useful knowledge anymore. And so even if you spend the time memorizing, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will appear in your games, and over time it may become outdated and less relevant. And so that's why, that reading ability, that will always be relevant and that will always be applicable in your games. And so it's important to know the difference between the two, and depending on your weaknesses, train accordingly. So what I want to do now is go over a couple of different resources. So let me switch the camera. So here we have 101 Weiqi, which is a really great site to, it's the biggest collection of problems that I've seen online. Unfortunately, the website's in Chinese, but there is luckily a Chrome extension that's a localizer that will turn some of the headings and things like that into English. So for instance, one great part is this, you can do what's called Guan. And then you can go, say you do 15Q, and then you can go do problems immediately. So like here, next problem, maybe something like this. No, too fancy. Just connect. You don't have to think so hard. Or something like this. Yeah, so this is a great, Guans are ranked and they're timed. So they stop you from doing problems that are too difficult. And yeah, so it can be a good way to train your ability. And because they're all ranked, it means you'll do problems at a certain difficulty. So for instance, I have challenges with doing 3Q problems. And so I might do 5Q as a warm-up, then move on to 4Q. And then once I've solved a couple of 4Q sets, and move up to 3Q. And then just every day repeating that. Although I think I have yet to move up, but yeah, it's something that will come in time. Otherwise, we have Tsumego Hero, which I already mentioned in another video. There are all sorts of, I mentioned already in this video, easy capture, easy life, easy kill. If you're a beginner, then I definitely recommend starting here. And then otherwise, I have some other collections like the Tsumego Dictionary, Korean Problem Academy, and this Life and Death one is actually the Cho's Encyclopedia of Life and Death. So this is one place where you can get access to them. The big difficulty with this website is that you don't have access to the answers, whereas on 101 Weiqi you do. So can I look at my previous sets? Breakthrough time. Oh, this is one of the ones I did this morning. So for instance here, I already looked at the answer, so I already know how to solve this one. But you can go to explore, and for instance, I was thinking this morning that this was the right move, and I couldn't quite get it to work. And then that's how I came to, yeah, exactly here. So having the answers, I think, can be quite useful for beginners because you don't know any shapes yet. And so, or even for more advanced players like me, like if it's a more difficult problem, sometimes it'll be a long time till I see the answer. And so it can be useful. So yeah, that's Tsumego Hero. And then, so there are even like really difficult problems here, like Gokyo Shomyo is like really difficult problem sets. Yeah, so all sorts of things here. And then there's Black to Play, which is also quite popular. So I think you can play here. And here they'll have your rank in the corner. And so as you do problems, oh, you can also show solutions. As you do problems, you'll be able to, can I go to the next one? Yeah, here, next problem. That's very easy. Let's see, what else do we have? Also easy. Easy, what else do we have? So you can see how, like, if they're easy, then this is a lot of fun. It can get a bit boring, so it's good that it becomes more difficult over time. Yeah, I shouldn't get too carried away with this, but yeah, so if you want something that's relatively simple, you don't want to think too much about the UI, then this can be a great website. Let's see, and then otherwise we have tumegotatsuki.org, which is basically just a bunch of collections. So here we have Cho Shikun's Encyclopedia of Life and Death. If you haven't noticed already, this is a very famous problem collection. But also Gokyo Shomyo, which I mentioned before. Igu Hatsurion is also really it's cited as the most difficult problem of all time. So if you want to try your hand at that, I wouldn't recommend trying your hand at that unless you're a professional. It's a complete waste of time, but it might be interesting if you're interested. Um, Otherwise, there are some books that you might get. So, say you don't want to play online because you can't stop yourself from clicking or something like that. Get Strong at Life and Death. It might be a good introductory book. Or also 1001 Life and Death Problems. This is the problem book that I had, and I've solved this book like maybe one, two, or three times. Like it was the only thing that I had access to, and so this is just what I used. Um, I would recommend not doing the same problem book multiple times. I think you should do the problem book, and then once you're done with it, move on. Or once the problems get too difficult for you, do something else. Because I think like variety is really important when it comes to life and death problems. But at the same time, going through a couple collections can also be instructive. Otherwise, some All About Life and Death from Shoji Gun as well is good for essential Tsumego. So this is not just the problems that you read, these are the problems that you probably memorize and that you keep in your memory because the shapes are so common. Um, Obviously, there are two books, so that's a lot of problems. So you probably wouldn't memorize all of them. You probably wait till they appear in your game and then use this as a reference. And then maybe like use something like Anki or some other spaced repetition system to remember it. But yeah, that's totally optional and not essential. Also, Youngsun Yoon also has a book called Mastering Basic Corner Shapes, which is basically the same. These are all essential Sumego, and these can be useful to know. Um, and yeah, so these are some references for you to get started. And yeah, so thanks for coming along to this discussion about how and when and in what case and how to use life and death problems. And I hope that it'll make you stronger. I know that when I do life and death problems, I'm a shade stronger, and when I don't, I'm definitely maybe a stone weaker. Like, um, although it might not be a way for you to consistently improve all the time, it's definitely something that will give you that short-term boost, but also a little bit over time as well if you're really diligent with it. So yeah, that's my video. And then yeah, if you enjoy this content, then like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.